All right, so my name is Alejandro Rojas. I work with OpenMinds.tv, where we also host the UFO Congress. So we post UFO news daily on that website. We do videos. We do every type of multimedia. We have a podcast that we do where we interview people every week. So it's true, we're looking at this information on a regular basis. And of course, with the Congress, we've been doing it since 2011. However, this will be the 26th annual conference coming up this year, so it's been going on for quite some time. And it's large, it's 5 days, and what we love to do is make sure that it's also affordable for people. So even though it's the longest in the number of days and number of speakers, it's less than other conferences out there. So we want to make sure, it's all about sharing information, and there's a lot of information to share. Throughout having all of these lectures, we've had a lot of people come from other countries. And some people don't know that there are governments out there that have ongoing official UFO investigations. They're government-sponsored departments. And when we've brought those officials, and I've been involved with MUFON for a long time. In fact, I was their spokesperson for a few years, and some of them I met back then. But they talk a lot about their systems and processes, but what's really cool and what they often don't talk about is why they even exist at all. Why did their governments get involved with this publicly? And the stories behind those reasons are extraordinary. Some of these cases are really cool. And so I've put together information like that to go through so you guys could see some of these cases, see some of our interviews with these people. This talk I actually put together for the MUFON Symposium, and I was able to do it there. However, I had to go through it really quickly. So luckily here I'm going to be able to take my time and get through everything. Now, luckily Dennis is videotaping this, so you'll be able to have that. But I also wrote a paper on this for the symposium. When you speak for the MUFON Symposium, you're supposed to write a paper on your talk. So that paper is really long, and it has all the sources in that paper as well. So you can get the symposium proceedings online on the MUFON website. So we'll begin, and we'll start covering this really cool info. And if I have time, which I'm sure I will, I'll be able to go into some new info too we've just posted recently. All right, here we go. So these countries, I'm going to focus on countries that have current existing government organizations. These countries do not. They've had them in the past. However, I want to cover these because they are important. First of all, Canada and the United Kingdom are close partners, and their history is very interesting. But of course, being here in the United States, everybody kind of took their lead from the United States. So it's a little bit important to understand them in order to, we'll reference them when we see why and how other governments got involved with this. So we'll start with the U.S. First of all, the United States started getting involved in 1947, and it was largely due to a case in 1947, Kenneth Arnold case. The reason why this became a big deal, or why that prompted it, it just got a lot of media. So this was a pilot. He was well respected. He was flying in the Washington area. He was actually helping look for another downed aircraft when he saw these objects, kind of like he described skipping. These objects then, even though he described them as skipping, but the media, and we'll see this over and over again, called them flying saucers, and he said they were skipping like saucers in water. He didn't say they looked like saucers, but that kind of got into our lexicon, and flying saucers is what the media has called the objects for a very long time. And at the end, from 47 to 49, Project Sign went on. At the end, in 1949, they wrote kind of a summary of the situation. What have we found thus far? And they essentially, the investigators said, well, it's an interesting topic. There are some credible cases. We don't necessarily know why people are seeing UFOs all over the place. However, they did in this paper say it could be extraterrestrial in nature. Well, actually, the top brass got a little upset about that. They said, you have no evidence of this. You shouldn't have put it in the paper. They had them remove it from the paper before they released that again. However, the public interest in the topic was still so great that they had to keep going, and they started Project Grudge. The best book for reference on all of this UFO study when it comes to the United States is written by Colonel Ruppelt. He actually was the director of Project Blue Book, and he wrote a report that covers all of this. And the reason I bring that up now is he says, even though when it comes to project names, they kind of pick them at random, Project Grudge was a good name because at this point, because of that report saying it could be extraterrestrial in nature, there was a grudge by the Air Force against the topic. So essentially, during the Project Grudge years, they just debunked everything. In 1951, they were getting a bad name because some of the people seeing sightings during this period of time were engineers that were well respected, pilots, and of course, even still during this time, if you were a World War II pilot or a World War II ace, you were very well respected, and more likely the public is going to believe what you have to say than the Air Force. And often the Air Force was coming out and saying, oh no, the UFO they said they saw was nothing. It was, stories like swamp gas or weather balloons and this sort of thing. So in 1951, when Ruppelt got involved, they asked him to assess the situation. What's going on here? We have a really bad name when it comes to this topic. Why is that? What should we do? He went out and did some research. He said that, they've lost all their credibility because all they do, instead of investigating, is debunking everything. He said, we still should continue to investigate, but we should be more open and forthright about it. And so they said, okay, go ahead and start up a UFO investigation group then. And they had him take over what became Project Blue Book, where they continued to do investigations. He really writes about some stories, especially in the early 50s, that were extraordinary. We posted a video recently about the Blue Book files, and we kind of used as a poster child for these cases Washington, D.C. Sightings in 1952. But those got a lot of public attention. Also, astronomers and their interests got a lot of public attention, so they couldn't really get rid of it. And it was the public's interest that really drove this. But he talks about how he continued to battle with credibility, people not wanting to bring their information. So finally, as time went on, the Air Force really didn't like doing this sort of work, and they tried to get out of it. The public, of course, wanted something that was an unbiased kind of analysis, saying there was nothing to this. And so they coupled with the University of Colorado. The Robert Condon was the professor in charge out of the University of Colorado who was tasked with investigating, putting together another final report in 1969. It began in 1968, their investigation. And, there's ample evidence and memos to show that he had his conclusions already worked out in his mind. There was even a memo between the university and him talking about how are we going to get away with this in a PR way. We don't want to look silly, but we really need to debunk this whole thing and make it go away. And so they did, despite the Condon report having some amazing cases, and many of those cases being scientifically investigated and still not being able to come up with an answer for them. The Condon said his conclusion that there was no scientific value to investigating UFOs. The Air Force then used that excuse to say that they found no value in investigating UFOs. The Air Force then officially got out of the UFO investigation business, and that's how the United States, in a nutshell, handled everything publicly. Now, we also have a video that we put out recently to demonstrate that although the Air Force ever since then has said that they're not in the UFO business, they don't investigate UFOs, that's not true. And of course, it used to be when we used to say this sort of thing, oh, you're a conspiracy theorist and everything like that. But I think these days, the public trust in government has eroded, especially in that everything is spun. That's just kind of what you do. Whenever something happens, you figure out how to tell the public in a way that works for your interests, which is exactly what's happened in this field. So people, I think, are not as, are more willing to understand that perhaps, the government did investigate, and they did. We did a video recently that kind of showed how they did it, in that there is a paper trail of investigations. There's a reporting system called OPREP-3, where if you have a very important situation that happens at a military base, you give it a call sign, essentially, as to how important that situation is. And this is the OPREP-3 reporting system. And the highest of those OPREP-3s is an OPREP-3 Pinnacle. And what that means is all of command of Air Force, all the way up, will immediately be notified of this situation. And now we have in the records that, the Air Force did use OPREP-3 Pinnacle reports for various UFO cases, especially cases that had to do with nuclear facilities. So we've got a whole video on that. You can see all of these for free on YouTube that we've posted. But the point being that they still investigate, just not publicly. And unfortunately, they are really, there's no other way to say it, that they're just being completely dishonest when they say they no longer investigate UFOs, nor have they since 1969, because their own records tell a completely different story. So that's the United States, just in a nutshell, because of course lots of people talk about that at length, but we want to talk about these other governments. Canada is something interesting to go into just shortly, because people don't know about what they've done so much. Really, most of what Canada did was around Project Magnet, which you see here. That was started by a gentleman called Wilbert Smith. He was a senior radio engineer for the Transport Canada's Broadcasting and Measurement Section. He had his own interest in UFOs, but he told the government, a Canadian government, he felt that the objects used electromagnetic forces in order to propel themselves, and that if he could observe them and understand that technology better, they could better understand radio waves and make better communications devices and those sort of things. And the government said, okay, start Project Magnet and look into it. He did that officially from 1950 until 1954. They essentially kind of stopped the public funding at that point, but he continued to do that until 1962. One of the most famous things he's ever talked about was a memo where he says that he did do some investigation into the United States Air Force and what they were doing, and that, UFOs, among other things, was a bigger secret than even the atomic bomb, and that it is something real. So that's where you hear about him a lot. But the Canadian government did start a very small official organization to investigate UFOs called Project Second Story. At their first meeting, here's what they said about UFOs. They are more than a hallucination, and that the data collected thus far has been haphazard, but they wanted to determine whether serious effort was justified in investigating UFOs. In 1954, they reviewed their reports, and at that time they actually said, it doesn't appear that there is enough data to systematically and scientifically analyze UFOs. So they closed Second Story, and as you can see, at that same time, they closed Project Magnet. Another project they were involved with, however, is this Service Merit Reporting Database. And this was in conjunction with the United States. So NORAD, some of you might have heard about that, but that's essentially NORAD out of Cheyenne Mountain or other locations. They observe everything in space, and that's their job, is to keep an eye on the sky. And that is a joint organization with Canada. And so Canada was asked to participate in these observations, and for many years, in fact, this is in our report about OPREP-3 and the reporting, this servant merit was the way that you were supposed to report objects that were of high intelligence importance, essentially. What's cool about this is on the whole story about Canada you can find on their website. They have an archive of all of their files. And they have this poster which talks about what to report to NORAD. And these were You can find similar posters for the United States Air Force, but one of the things you're supposed to report is unidentified flying objects. And you can see there's a little flying saucer and a little rocket type of craft, like a Flash Gordon type of thing, right there on their poster, giving them instructions on what to report. It just demonstrates in the record, that they took the topic seriously. So that's a little bit about Canada. Finally, we'll get into the United Kingdom, because they have actually a very interesting and rich history when it comes to UFOs. In fact, they officially investigated them essentially from 1950 until 2009. The first organization was the Flying Saucer Working Party, which started in 1950. It was started by the Ministry of Defense Chief Scientific Advisor, Sir Henry Tizard. And Sir Henry Tizard was involved. He was interested in UFOs. In fact, he was for some time. However, even though the United States was investigating UFOs since 1947, the British, for the most part, thought we were silly. They thought the U.S. was ridiculous. Why are they wasting their time on it? But secretly, Henry Tizard was interested in UFOs. So he started what was called the Flying Saucer Working Party, where they analyzed what the U.S. had, the whole situation to figure out, should the British get their own organization going? In 1951, they published their final report. It was secret, actually. Everything they did, even the existence of this organization, was completely secret. The official records on them didn't even come out until like about 2012. But they had determined there was no reason to investigate UFOs, so they shouldn't start up a group in 1951. However, as with many of these other governments, as we'll see, even with our own, the phenomena doesn't necessarily care what you think of it. It's going to kind of dictate what happens. And they had a lot of sightings during this period of time. And, of course, the 1952 thing, because it was so huge here, especially over Washington, D.C., the news got over there. So there was a lot of public interest. Also, interestingly enough, there were others in the military that were interested. So one gentleman, there's a couple PBS shows, because the British love doing dramas about their own history, so like Downton Abbey, things like that. I don't know if anybody's watching The Crown right now on Netflix. It's a great series. There's another one out there, Indian Summers, that is about India. The reason I bring this up, and actually the last time I spoke with you all, and I brought this up at the Congress, is that Lord Mountbatten was one of the people that was interested in UFOs. And Lord Mountbatten is essentially, he's the uncle to Prince Philip. He also was Prince Philip's father, the biggest father figure he had. Prince Philip, essentially, before he got married to the Queen, he had kind of a crazy life, and his father essentially left him and ran off and married someone. So it was his Lord Mountbatten who took care of him for a long time, and he was really into UFOs. Lord Mountbatten, I brought up the Indian, they have him on this Indian Summers program because he was also the last Viceroy of India. So he was in charge of India, but while they transitioned and broke it into, India and Pakistan. So he was really into UFOs. In my other talk that I did here at the Congress, we talked about how he felt the UFO landed on his land, and he went and investigated that. Some of his staff had witnessed that. But he was also secretly pressuring the newspapers in the UK to cover serious UFO research. And he did get them to start to serialize some of the bigger books here in the United States. And so that, along with the sightings, got the public really interested in the topic to where the Ministry of Defense just had to do something. And they started up their defense project in 1953. That continued to run until 2009, so fairly recently. And of course, one of the people we get a lot of insight into this from is Nick Pope, who used to actually work for this UFO desk for a period of time in the 90s. We've had him speak. I think he's spoken here and also at our event several times. So he's a great wealth of information. But what's interesting about the way the British are more upfront. So, for example, they've had reports as well, and they've had reports that have speculated the extraterrestrial hypothesis to UFOs, but they don't get so uppity about all of it. They just say, okay, this is the way it is. In fact, one of my favorite reports from 1995, this was their conclusion. If the sightings are devices not of the earth, then their purpose needs to be established as a matter of priority. There have been no apparent hostile intent, and other possibilities are military reconnaissance, scientific, or tourism. So very matter of fact, they sat back and thought, perhaps they're tourists. We enjoy a holiday, and they must as well. So there's a whole rich history there to the UK as well, and it's a great rich history that really isn't told that often. Really, the best place to go read and find out about that really is Nick Pope's website. I think he's got the most history when it comes to the UK at his website. But we want to get involved with the actual existing organizations. And this is where I get to. Luckily, I am fluent in about 36 languages, as you'll find here. Just kidding. I can barely. I'm pretty good with English, but beyond that, I struggle. But I'll pretend my best that I know how to pronounce some of these things. But bear with me on that, because France especially, there's a lot of phrases that they use, and they're very particular about the use of their different phrases. But France, they are the only essentially large Western power with an official UFO organization. It is called JPAN. Some say it GayPan, but we'll go over the history of this because this is really interesting. They began looking into UFOs and collecting after World War II, and it was their gendarmes that, for the most part, has collected their UFO information. The gendarmes, I kind of talked about this too when I did my other talk on Italy, and they're a national police force. So in a lot of other countries, a national police force takes charge of these sort of topics. So essentially they're a police force, but they answer to the Ministry of Defense. It would be sort of, we don't really have anything like it. Maybe the closest here would be somewhat the FBI, somewhat ICE. Probably ICE would be closest because they get involved more with what we're doing here. But that would be the closest to what we have. During the early years, they had a lot of military people talking about UFOs. And in 1967, finally, there was a formal confidential UFO research organization that was approved. So it took them until 1967 to get involved with it. What's interesting here, and what's interesting when we go through these countries, is where they decide to put these organizations. In this case, Jean-Luc Bruneau, who was a former inspector general at the Commissariat à l'Énergie Atomique, or the CIA, so essentially their atomic energy agency, is who began their UFO research. He said he proposed 3 objectives to studying UFOs. First of all, the probability of the existence and search for extraterrestrial intelligence. That's what they wanted to look into. What our relations could be with them through space, and what is going on in our terrestrial environment. In other words, the study of phenomena aerospatial non-identified, or unidentified aerospace phenomenon. And actually, that term right there was really important to them. He felt that we don't know what's going on. These objects are not necessarily all material. Sometimes they're lights in the sky. So this term, unidentified aerospace phenomena, was really important to them. And that's a term they continued to use going forward. In fact, it's similar to a term we use here. The reason, Jean-Luc says, that this organization was given the green light, essentially, by President de Gaulle of France at the time, is because President de Gaulle was really concerned about a sighting that took place in 1954. This is probably one of the most amazing sightings on record, and most likely the biggest mass sighting, much bigger than the Phoenix Lights. Somewhat similar, but much more extraordinary. It happened in the town of Tananarive in Madagascar. That's what the French called it. We call it Antananarivo. Madagascar was a French colony from 1897 to 1960. That's why the French were so concerned with this incident. But what happened is on August 15th, 1954 at 5 p.m., an electric green ball was seen descending towards the ground. Everyone watched it as it dropped behind a hill. They expected to hear a large explosion, but there was none. What's so extraordinary about this, and why they say everybody, is that the capital was the main hub for shopping in Madagascar, and it was a big tourist location. So they had this big street with lots of restaurants and shopping and everything. So it's always packed, full of people. So this place is completely packed, and everybody was witnessing this event. They looked for the explosion, but none happened. Then the UFO reappeared, and it was larger, they said. It circled around the town. People described it as a lens-shaped plasma, about 130 feet long, with long sparks coming out of the rear. It was followed by a silvery metallic football-shaped object. Both of them, as they flew around, were completely silent. They said the shop lights died out as the craft flew over and relit once it passed. The animals howled and barked and seemed to be in a state of panic. The object then flew off to the west and then was seen by some farms. They estimated the witnesses to be near 200,000 people. So just a huge amount of people saw this. Now this report, and most of I think what the best reference for this sighting is from what's called the Cometa report. That's an important French document that we'll talk a little bit more about in a little bit here. But this document essentially was created and researched, in this case was researched by former military and government officials in France. So that's why you can, believe that they've done a lot of research to figure out things like. And so when a group like this says there are 200,000 people that witnessed it, most likely there were. So that was a really amazing case. The group, however, that Charles de Gaulle, had okayed that Jean-Luc Bruno was going to start, never got completed because of political unrest in May through June of 1968. I don't know if many of you know the political history of France. Oh, a couple of people do. There was essentially almost like a coup that happened, a small civil war type of thing that happened, and the government was almost toppled, and actually the president, de Gaulle, had to leave France for a period of time before returning. And once he returned, a lot of the problems that people had were around spending. And so when he returned, he had to be very careful with his budget, and he couldn't justify investigating UFOs. Unfortunately. So it wasn't until 1973 that France got back into the UFO business, and it's because of this guy, Claude Poher. He's kind of the Stanton Friedman of France. You can see he's a little younger, but he got started, about the same time, actually. But he got started because a large wave of sightings had prompted the defense minister, Robert Galley, to acknowledge on a program that UFOs did exist. He essentially told people on the radio that during this sighting, when they interviewed him, to keep an open mind with UFOs. So then, in 1974, largely because of the public interest, because of these sightings, the gendarmes began sending their reports to the, I'm not going to attempt to say it because it's another difficult one, but it's called the CNES, which is France's National Center for Space Studies. It's essentially like they're NASA. So these police started sending the reports to NASA for people to look at. Nobody really took too much attention until Claude Poher decided to start looking at these cases, and he did a statistical study on it. He actually got interested in UFOs because he saw these cases coming in. He decided to actually read the Condon report. He had taken it at face value that, okay, Dr. Condon said there's nothing to UFOs. I'm going to read the report and look at these cases. And when he read the report, it thoroughly convinced him that there is something to this phenomena, and that's what prompted him to take it seriously, and that's what prompted him to look at these cases in the mid-70s. He then, after going over all of these cases, began to work with Jacques Vallée, and they put together a report that they gave to the American Institute of Astronautics and Aeronautics here in the United States. It was a big deal because these both, especially Claude Poher, I mean, he's an official for France's NASA, essentially, coming and doing a report for a large astronomical society about UFOs, along with Jacques Vallée, who people knew were into it, and of course is very well respected. If you don't know who Jacques Vallée is, he actually was at our last UFO Congress, first conference he's been at in a long time. He's a venture capitalist, along with a computer engineer. He's just done a lot of amazing things in his life, but one of those things he's always been involved with is UFOs, largely because he was a student of J. Allen Hynek, who was the astronomer who was a consultant to the U.S. Air Force during their investigations. Hynek was the guy who at first came up with the idea of some of the debunking, like swamp gas, but later came to believe that UFOs were real and continued to investigate them throughout his life. And Jacques Vallée, as a student, also aided him in that. In 1976, Poher proposed to the CNES that they actually create a UFO group. Another organization called the Advanced Studies in National Defense Organization said that they would partner up with him. And that was a big deal. It's kind of like here, the closest thing would be DARPA. I mean, it's a huge organization of scientists that works on defense technology, partnered up with him to investigate UFOs. So he was also able to go to the Air Force, the Gendarmerie, Civil Aviation, and the National Meteorological Office to all get them sign up saying, yeah, sure, we'll send you information and we'll help you investigate UFOs. So in 1977, they started their UFO group, and it was called GEPAN, G-E-P-A-N, which essentially was a national group to study unidentified objects, aerospace objects. But they had a scientific council, and they still do, that has to review all of their work on a yearly basis. At that time, they were given a staff of 6 or 7 people. In 1978, they had sent out a report on their findings. They had looked at 678 reports. 26% were categorized as identifiable. Another 36 or 26 as identifiable, 36 were insufficient information, and the remaining 38% were unidentified, which is a really high number, especially compared to like with the numbers that Dennis had shown us earlier. In 1979, JPAN held a gathering of about 100 people from over 40 civilian organizations, essentially getting the public involved to talk to them about UFO research. And in 1979, Poher had actually come out and said that he determined UFOs were real, and he presented his information to the Scientific Council. Now, those are the only things we know because those were publicly given to, people by Poher and others. But really, all of those reports that they generated, nobody has seen yet. They really don't have a Freedom of Information Act like we do, and all of those reports were secret. In 1979, Poher resigned, And this person took over, Elaine Esterl. And this is kind of became a period of time where there was more activity, more great cases that made it to the public, and are still famous to this day. A lot of these cases were featured in that Cometa report. And here's one of them. In January 8th of 1981, there's a case called Trans in Provence. This is probably their most famous case and the one that Japon likes the best. So essentially what happened here is that a farmer, Renato Nicolai, he was 55-year-old. He says a UFO landed on his property and then took off almost immediately. Thinking it was a military experimental device, Nicolai notified the local gendarmes on the following day. The gendarmes interviewed Nicolai and collected soil and plant samples from the landing site within 24 hours of the occurrence. They then notified Japan on January 12th, a few days later, as part of their cooperation agreement. Further collection of samples were taken and measured by Japan, and they were analyzed by some government laboratories. The first detailed report on the case was published by Japan in 1983. You can see a graphic. He described the object as two bowls on top of each other, and as it flew away, he saw these little round objects on the bottom. He essentially, you could see here, said he saw it fly in, raise up, and then fly over his shed. It was analyzed by this gentleman. Looks very scientific. He is Michael Bonayes of the National Institute of Agronomy. I might not be saying that right, even though that's an English word. That is the science and technology of producing plants and food. So that was his specialty. But he took a look at that plant soil, and so did others. He was just in charge of the investigation. And here's what his conclusion was. He said, it was not the aim of the author to identify the exact nature of the phenomena observed on the 8th of January at Trans-en-Provence, but it can reasonably be concluded that something unusual did occur that might be consistent, for instance, with an electromagnetic source or stress. Over the years, a few more cases like this happened, and this is what even today France will talk the most about. It's how excited they are about physical trace cases when something has been affected, like plants or the ground, and they're able to take that and research it. These were their top cases, are still their top cases that happened mostly back during that period of time. You can see Trans and Provence here. Another really important one to them is this one, the Amarante case. It's called La Amarante, not because of a place. That's actually the type of plant that was affected. This took place in a town called Nancy in France in 1982. In this case, they felt it was really important for two reasons. First of all, the eyewitness to the UFO was a biologist, so he was highly reliable, someone well respected, and also the case involved effects to vegetation. The sighting began as a witness saw an ovoid object which silently descended into his garden. He said the object simply hovered above, about 3 feet above the ground, and for about 20 minutes. The witness states that when the UFO rose up, the vegetation underneath did the same, rose with it. The effects had been determined to be from electromagnetic energy. So he said this was just some small elliptical object that had dropped into his garden and sat there for 20 minutes. Pretty weird one. Once, in 1983, Jean-Jacques Velasco took over Japan. He used to work on satellites as an engineer. And then in 1988, they changed the name from Japan to SEPRA for a few years. So essentially what happened is, even though they had found this information, scientists found it interesting, people in the government did, there still was a lot of problem with people arguing that they shouldn't be spending money on it. In 1988, they changed the name and the purpose to look at atmospheric reentry phenomena, and it remained that until 2005 when they added the I, Japan, and then focused it back on UFOs. They added the I for information. So essentially their point was, we're going to begin investigating UFOs again, but, don't get mad at us, everybody, because we're going to share this information with the public. So their purpose was to be much more open. There wasn't a whole lot that happened during this time, though, because essentially Jean Velasco was the only guy that was tasked with doing any of this. So he kind of had to do it on his own. UFO research in France then picked up in 1999, largely due to the Cometa report. And a lot of people, when you think about France and UFOs, you think about the Cometa report. That's the thing that you see on the internet. But it wasn't a governmental organization. It was a non-government report, but it included a lot of retired military. The organization had an Air Force general who was a weapons engineer, a chief of police. It also had a technical director from Air France, a squadron commander from the Air Force, and another Air Force general. The report was released on May 31st, 2010, and it concluded that UFOs are definitely real and possibly of extraterrestrial origins. Retired French Air Force General Denis Letty, here you can see his quote, he said, "The accumulation of well-documented sightings made by credible witnesses forces us to consider from now on all of the hypotheses regarding the origins of unidentified flying objects or UFOs and the extraterrestrial hypothesis in particular." On their website, you can see some of their records. They'll tell you at least general information about their sightings. They say that since 1977, they've collected about 6,000 reports. Here you can see they say about 22% have remained unexplained. This, up until recently, was the gentleman who was heading the organization, and we spoke with him. Here's what he has to say.
In France, we are a civil institute. Our goal is not to protect the country. Our goal is to try to understand this phenomenon and to try to reply to the French population to explain what can be. We open roughly 200 folders per year, and among that, we can say that about 10% in the recent years, let's say 20 reports per year, would be classified as unidentified.
They're still really careful. You didn't have a whole lot to say, really. They're still really careful about working with the scientific community in France and about not upsetting them. So he in particular is very careful about all the verbiage that you use when you talk about what they do. Every time I write a story, I'll get an email. Well, you should fix this or clarify that. But they're still going. You don't hear a lot about France and what they're doing, but they are still doing investigations. However, the most exciting stuff probably is happening in South America. France is the only large Western country doing anything. But there are a lot of South American countries. In particular, we'd be talking about Chile, Paraguay, Uruguay, Peru, mainly Chile, though. They're the big one. So we'll look a little bit about these before we move on. The first group was Uruguay. They were the first in South America to start investigating UFOs. They started what they called crypto-ovni. So ovni, some of you may know, is the name that is used in a lot of countries for UFO. It essentially is an unidentified flying object. So let's see if I can try to pronounce one of these. Spanish, for instance, is objeto volador no identificado. So that's where ovni comes from and why you see it so often in some countries. But they started the Commission for the Reception and Investigation of Reports of Unidentified Flying Objects under their Air Force on August 7th, 1979. They said they did so in response to dozens of complaints from Uruguayan people in different parts of the country who were seeing UFOs. They have 7 staff. They work with several organizations, civilian and otherwise. Their mission is to receive, consider, and evaluate all reports of UFO sightings in the air national jurisdiction of the Uruguayan Air Force area, according to law such and such. Some of the things that they look at are, of course, what is the likelihood of fraud on these cases? What is it likely to be conventional phenomena? Is it psychological or an illusion? Or is it something unconventional? We'll get into this gentleman, Colonel Ariel Sanchez. So we were able to interview him, and he told us in 2012 that they have over 1,200 cases that they have investigated. However, only 3% are unsolved. Still, they're really good cases. He said, these are the cases we refer to as unconventional or UFOs. Some of his favorite: in 1986, 2 jet fighters pursued a luminous sphere over Palmar Dam. The spheres flew off too quickly for the jets to follow. They said as soon as the jets landed, the objects reappeared. They scrambled the jets, but when the jets got there, again, they were gone. And this is probably, if you look at the military files, the most common thing that happens. Even if you look at Blue Book, if you look at the Washington, D.C. case in 1952, same thing. Jets would be scrambled for objects that are caught on radar, seen by control towers. As soon as the jets get there, the objects either disappear or fly off at extremely fast speed. The jets then go home. As soon as the jets land, the objects come back. I mean, if you look at the military records, that's what happens over and over and over again. And that's what happened to these guys, too. Another case in 1996, this is a really weird one. A group of pilots in a local airport's control tower saw 2 luminous spheres over San Bernardino Airport and Paralata Air Force Base in Durazno. They said that they saw these 2 luminous spheres, and then the spheres disappeared. They think they zoomed off very quickly. However, their glow diminished over time, so that they left some kind of residual glow that just slowly diminished over time until there was just an outline of the circles that was left that then disappeared. Sanchez said these weren't satellites, as they do not fly in formation or that low, since these objects were at 10,000 feet, nor do satellites diminish their glow. He says that they also are open to receive and investigate cases of cattle mutilation and alien abduction. This is one of their most famous cases, and you may have seen this because it's a famous UFO video out there. It was taken in July of 1930 during a World Cup. There's an object right there, and if we zoom in, you could see it. Now, they love this case because they debunked it. So what they said is they didn't really look into it until 1985. They were able to get the original glass plates. When they zoomed in, they were able to see on the side the name of a business, a local business, and it turned out it was a car sales place. So it was a balloon used by a car sales organization. The reason they love this case is because it brings them credibility. They're able to say, hey, the most famous Uruguayan UFO photo, we were able to figure out what it was. However, just because they debunked this famous case, it doesn't mean they're not into the topic. They just want to make sure that, they're seen as credible, that they're seen as people doing real research. In fact, Sanchez says, the UFO phenomena is recognized by the Uruguayan Air Force as a real phenomenon. Its point of origin is unknown, and we don't know if it's a lower atmospheric phenomena that we have not cataloged yet, a physical phenomena, or if there's a possibility of someone sending a probe to our system, to our planet, just as we are sending probes to Mars and other parts of our planetary system. He says the Air Force doesn't rule out the extraterrestrial hypothesis, but personally, I am inclined to believe in a closer hypothesis. that of a superior intelligence interacting with us in these unidentified flying objects. From where they come or how they get there, I don't know, but we are seeing them, we are photographing them, we have chased and tried to grab them in order to identify them without success. So they're still really into it. It's still a real big deal to them. And I'll go over a little bit, though, this next one, but they wanted me to give them a 5-minute. Is it about time for the break? Okay. So they can get cookies ready. But this is the most important organization, which is Chile. They're called CFAA. The reason I say they're the most important is because they're the most active. Right now, I mean, this organization's taken very seriously. They're doing investigation. They're holding meetings with other government officials. I mean, they're really the most active getting things going out there. They're called the Committee for a Study of Aerial Anomalous Phenomena, and they like to say it CFAA. For some reason, they're very particular about that. But it was created by their Directorate of Civil Aviation, which is similar to our FAA. So I think it's always interesting just to think about, what if our FAA decided they wanted to investigate UFOs and start a department? Well, that's what happened in Chile in 1997. They were inspired to do so by sightings in the city of Arica. And in particular, these sightings, they happened in March 31st, 1997. At about 12:55 a.m., 3 UFOs were seen by the control tower of the International Airport of Chacolata, confirmed on radar at 10,000 to 15,000 feet and tracked up to speeds of 8,000 miles per hour. They were spotted over the beach, and they emitted blue, red, green, and yellow lights, making them very visible. It was, again, this was a beach that there were lots of tourists out, hanging out and everything, so a lot of people saw these objects. According to CNN News, the airport chief, Mr. Julio Schnettler, said the experience was wonderful. He was skeptic about UFOs, but not anymore. He also stated that they moved at astonishing speeds. In the news reports, the DGCA recognized publicly that Chile is experiencing UFO sightings and that the phenomena is real, not meteorological or climatic. So some of you may remember Chicago O'Hare. That was about 2008, where there's a UFO seen over Chicago O'Hare. They had to close a gate for a period of time. The UFO shot up and through the clouds, and the people who reported this were United Airlines employees. They reported it to the Chicago Tribune. Chicago Tribune wrote a story on it, and the FAA said, no, we never got any reports on that. Chicago Tribune luckily didn't stop. They really pressed this. They put in FOIA requests, and the FAA had to admit, oh yeah, we did, but it was probably just a weather phenomenon. But what if the FAA had come back and said, oh yeah, we investigate UFOs, they're a real phenomenon, and they aren't weather? Like this statement here, they're not meteorological or climatic. Oh yeah, that's a real phenomenon. I mean, that's essentially what happened here, is their version of the FAA said, oh yeah, UFOs, sure, we're looking at those. In fact, we'll start a department to investigate them, which is what they did. So, although they're under their version of the FAA, the Civil Aviation Organization, they like to be clear that they work with all of their other departments and government organizations. So even though that structurally they're under their civil aviation, they're almost like their own independent governmental organization, and they work with everyone. In fact, their director here is General Ricardo Bermudez, who is a retired Chilean Air Force general. They say they're supported by each branch of the military. They also liaison with Uruguay's Credovni and France's Japon. They actually also work closely now with NARCAP, which is an organization here in the United States that's headed by Ted Rowe and Dr. Hines. Ted Rowe actually is going to be speaking at our conference, and we'll be talking about this a little later, but they're the ones who coined the term UAP, unidentified aerial phenomena, which is a term they like to use, or UAP. They like to use that term because of the baggage with UFO. You know, when you say UFO, people in the media or whatever think of little green men and little craft. So they try to use a more scientific term, UAP, and we'll talk about this maybe a little later, but that's essentially why you hear that term more often, because of these guys. So they work closely with them as well. Bermuda said he used to be a skeptic. Luckily, I've got to speak quite a bit with him. We had him speak at the UFO Congress before. He said he was a skeptic. However, there was one case in particular in June 23rd, 2010, that changed his mind about this. It was the Alpha Pelican case, is what they call it. He says 3 planes were bound for Arturo Marina Benitez Airport that reported UFO. 2 craft reported the UFO at 4,000 feet simultaneously. Soon after, a military craft reported seeing the same object at 300 feet. He says, think for a moment. If one experienced commercial pilot reports to me that something flew across in front of his airplane, I pay careful attention. But now if a second commercial pilot reports the same a few seconds later, I become interested. But if a third pilot, a military one, confirms the same fact, I tend to believe it. In this case, do we have 1 UFO close to the airplanes, or do we have 2 UFOs? If we have 1, it's incredible. Its incredible speed does not correspond with anything that we have now. Here's Jose Ley. He's their international affairs director. We got to interview him at a conference.
They don't get embarrassed, not at all. There is no ridicule on the subject. If you think that 85% of the population believes in the phenomena, it is impossible to actually try to ridicule. Now, we do have plenty of what you may call debunkers, but they are slowly dying out because they make no sense.
Oh. He just talks a lot about how everybody, or most people in Chile, take the topic really seriously, including everyone in the government. You know, when they have a sighting report, they call whoever. They never have any problem with being taken seriously. So they've got a unique environment there. And I'll go over, before we go over some of the cases, just a little bit more about Bermudez and how he talks about what their organization does. They've got some great cases, though, that we'll go over in a little bit here. He summed up their goals. They don't know what they are and where they come from. It is necessary to continue studying the phenomena. It's necessary to share all the information. Bermudez also proposes an international effort, and that's really one thing that they lobby for across the world. An international effort that focuses on these 3 points. It's necessary to have a serious agency to direct all of the investigations in all the world. This agency must collect and share information and proceed to make an effective scientific investigation. He says, I believe that this agency should be located in the United Nations as part of the space affairs. And actually, that almost happened. It kind of did. The United Nations did create or pass a UFO decision, it's called. We'll talk about that in detail in a little bit here. But he says, I believe all possibilities of risks to our air operations, no matter how incredible, must be investigated. To ignore it is irresponsible. That's some of the difficulty, too, that someone like Nick Pope, for instance, has. When the UK government says that they're not investigating UFOs, he knows very well they are at some level because they have to. Somebody's got to be looking at it. If you have some unknown object in the air that is sharing airspace with civilian or military aircraft, they've got to have a concern. They've got to be doing something about it. Luckily, Nick will now admit that there probably is just behind-the-scenes sort of things, but it is kind of silly that, you know, the way we handle it in the United States is, oh, no, we're not really looking into it. In fact, if you call the FAA up right now and you said, hey, I see this huge object zipping around that's really strange. I know this because I've called on the behalf of others, or to find out what they did when others called. They just tell you to call someone else. They tell you to call the New Fork, which is a one-man show collecting UFO reports in Washington, or they tell you to call Bigelow Aerospace, which is another organization that collects UFO reports sometimes, but they're busy with other things mostly. Unfortunately, they rarely, if ever, say call MUFON, because New Fork has already gotten in there, but sometimes they will. I've had law enforcement when I was with MUFON, or people say they were recommended by FAA to call MUFON, but they tell you to go call somebody else, which seems absolutely ridiculous and, like Bermuda says, irresponsible. They take it, just to see how seriously they take it. This is Leslie Kean. She wrote the book, UFOs, I always get the title wrong, generals, officials, and other important people go on the record. But it's a great book where she had Bermudez and others write about UFOs and stuff like that. She is their official spokesperson. And this is the sort of reception she gets from the media, but it's not just the media, it's the government. They take this really seriously, and when she comes to do a talk, you know, they greet her like this. We'll take a break, but I'll tell you one more story. We'll watch you later. Actually, let's go ahead and I'll show you this video of this great case, and then we'll take a break. But they've been doing a lot of investigations, and sometimes their investigations have made it into the news, actually quite a bit. We'll see others when we get back from our break, but I'll show you one before we go. But here is Fox News.
All right, I want to get our crowd to weigh in on this next story. You're going to watch the screen. We're going to talk about this UFO. A UFO sighting in Chile? The country's government there releasing these pictures showing what they believe to be an unidentified flying object. The UFO was spotted by mine workers, saying that the object was silent, flying low, and slow over the area for more than an hour. The Chilean officials in the government, they say it's not ours. And the Aeronautical Society says we had no planes in the sky. We don't know what it is. And they've ruled out meteorological data. I mean, it was a beautiful sunny day, no clouds. What do you guys think? UFO? Yes. You guys are smart.
Who had the phone? E.T. phone home?
We are ready to believe you.
We are. These folks are on my side.
It's an interesting story. Of course, the news people are kind of knuckleheads and actually make themselves look pretty silly, which is common when they cover UFO stories. But we'll go over a couple other cases and a really cool meeting that they had recently regarding UFOs and summarizing the topic. And then we'll get into a couple other countries, but then we'll talk about the United Nations after the break. But let's go ahead and eat some cookies and cake. All right, so, and despite the audio, Phoenix really is, Arizona has one of the best MUFON groups. There's no other, well, you know, like I said, I did PR for MUFON. I've talked and gone to a lot of different MUFON organizations. And there's a couple big ones in California, but other than that, this is one of the biggest, most well-organized MUFON chapters out there. We're really, really lucky to have them, and I'm just so pleased that I live in the area and am able to make it out here. The Phoenix Lights, too, is going to be a big part of the Congress this year. We're going to have some witnesses and that sort of thing. We haven't really announced everything we're doing around it because we're still nailing everything that's going to be kind of the center, because it's the 20th anniversary of the Phoenix Lights. That'll be happening next year. So it's a big deal. And the cool thing, it's funny that Jim reminds me, I've been to so many conferences where we're next door or we're near like a wedding or some other event. In fact, I remember one event. It was the UFO Crash Conference in Las Vegas. There was a wedding right next door. So, you know, you get that look where people look at you really weird and everything. So they obviously were not happy to have the UFO people next door. But then we weren't happy when the party started. And Nick Redfern, who of course many of you know is kind of soft-spoken, is trying to talk over the party and the boom, boom, boom. So luckily at the UFO Congress, we have the entire place. The entire location is nothing but UFO people. You don't have the awkward elevator ride with your UFO badge, where they're kind of, everybody's had this, and they're looking at your badge and whispering to each other. Instead, you know, everybody in the elevator is a UFOer. And nowhere is UFOing as exciting as Chile. This is really cool. This occurred in 2014, and actually Leslie Kean was able to break the story in a blog on the Huffington Post. The Chilean government said UFOs pose no threat. And how did they determine this? They didn't just kind of willy-nilly, and it wasn't just the CFAA organization. They had high-level meetings with many government officials. Leslie wrote, among the DGAC specialists, remember that's like their FAA, were the director of the Meteorological Observatory, the chief of radar operations for the Metropolitan Center, the head of accident investigations, the director of airport security, an aerospace engineer, representatives from every branch of the armed services and the police. There was a Navy commander who was in charge of flight security for Navy aviation. There were also several pilots, and Bermudez himself was a combat pilot. But they said, based on the evaluation at the meeting, the committee concluded that the UAP do not present a threat or a danger to air operations, either civilian or military. Although there have been a small number of accidents attributed to UAP around the world, none have withstood an objective examination that presented unmistakable proof that UAP were the cause. They looked at mostly military cases, and as we said, for the most part with military cases, they chase the objects run away or go away. Then when the jets leave the area, the objects come back. And based off of that and off of the sightings, they said, we don't see that whatever the motives are, that they are malevolent and that this poses a threat. It is funny because they did have discussion about the biggest threat being distracted by UFOs. That pilots are trying to see what the heck that is, and that was the biggest threat to air security or air safety. So this was a really important meeting. You can see all of the people there, and they said, you know, I was able to speak with a couple of guys. When they went to this meeting, it was already a foregone conclusion by all of these officials and heads of the military that this was a real phenomenon. It wasn't that they had to, at first, examine that and establish that. They already came to the meeting with that idea, so they were seriously evaluating the nature of the phenomenon. Peru is another place that has an organization, and this is really cool because the guy who runs it has had some incredible experiences. He's a neat guy. This was established in 2001 as the Office of Anomalous Aerial Phenomena, or OIFA. They all have funny names. They went dormant in 2005 because of a lack of funds. However, they started up again in 2013 as DIFA. They're a department under the Peruvian Air Force Directorate of Aerospace Interests, which is their equivalent to U.S. Air Force Space Command. So these days, I think people are more familiar with it. When I first started writing about it or talking about it, people weren't, and they doubted it was even true. But most people realize that we do have something called Air Force Space Command. It sounds kind of crazy, but it's real. They're mostly headquartered out of the Colorado area. That's why I used to be so interested. That's where I'm from. They were in the city, Aurora, Colorado. They moved out to Peterson Air Force Base where they are now, but they mostly are in charge of satellites and things going on in space. Now, I do some talks where they do have some really interesting comments about their research and developing triangular craft and things like this. However, they are real. So again, shocking, you know, an organization similar to Space Command creating a UFO research organization. The commander is Julio Chamorro Flores. He founded and directs the groups. He was asked to develop the agency in 1999, and he relied on the help of CFAA to start it. Chamorro said it was his experience in flight operations and drug interdictions that made him familiar with UFO sightings. So why is that important, drug interdiction? Essentially, those are the people who are going after unknown aircraft. When there's an aircraft without a transponder, you know, they've got to check it out because most likely it's somebody running drugs. So, however, that's not always the case. One really important or bigger case that we were able to actually break at Open Minds TV was the Homeland Security case. So in Peru, or in Puerto Rico a couple years ago, there was an object seen coming over the ocean and over an airport and then turning around and going back over the ocean. At least that's what the Homeland Security pilots believed the object did. They caught it on their infrared radar. They couldn't figure out what it was. They say they sent it up to their superiors. Their superiors said, we don't know what it is. So they said, can you send it to the Air Force? The Air Force said they didn't know what it was. Maybe you should check with some UFO organization. So they did. They got a hold of some people who are MUFON researchers. They call themselves SCU now, but they did it. They're actually some of the directors, scientific directors, and with MUFON. And they had to do it independent because the witnesses wanted to remain anonymous. And that's one thing. If you submit a report to MUFON, you can remain anonymous, but you have to at least reveal your identity to MUFON. These people didn't want to do that, so they felt safer doing it independently. But nobody's been able to figure out what that object was. I've talked with FLIR experts, and they couldn't figure that out. But they were the same thing. It was drug interdiction. They looked for planes, and in this case, they saw an object. They didn't know what the heck it was. And that's what happened with Chamorro. That's what he worked on, and that's why he was into UFOs. And eventually they asked him to start their official organization. This is a really important case, and this is the case that got Chamorro into UFOs. It's called the La Jolla case, and essentially it's referred to as a dogfight with UFOs. The case was publicized in a declassified document issued by the United States Defense Intelligence Agency. So this was another example that the United States was looking into UFO cases. The event took place at the La Jolla Air Base in Arequipa, Peru on April 11, 1980 at 7:15 a.m. and was witnessed by nearly 2,000 base personnel. Chamorro says it was the time of day when all of the personnel stand in formation to receive orders and then go to work. So at the Peruvian base they do this thing where everybody comes out and marches and they stand all together out in the field, and then they're given their orders. It's kind of a ceremony type of thing that they do on every morning. And it was during this time, and Chamorro was there, when a UFO was seen above the base and everybody saw it. Commander Oscar Santa Maria Huertas piloted the jet that pursued the object. He says he fired around 60 rounds of 30-millimeter shells at the object, but it had little effect. He says one of the rounds would have blown up a truck, but that this object seemed to absorb them. After 22 minutes of chasing the object, Huertas said he was running out of fuel and had to return to the base. He was flying a Sukhoi 22 jet. That's what this is. This is a video that we had put together that shows essentially what they said. So while 2,000 people are out there, they see this jet scrambled to chase this object. That's generally the shape that he said it would look like. And that's exactly what the jet looks like. So this is a recreation of that. So here is Chamorro. We were able to interview him. So he says there were two big cases that they investigated in the early years of their organization. The first one was by Peruvian President Alberto Fujimori in 1991. This is a big deal just because he was a president. The veracity is a little bit in question because it's just a report that he received from someone. However, it's a report that he believed. He believed it was a credible source because he knew the person. This person was a crew member of an Air Force seaplane that was used by Fujimori for fishing. He reported they all had seen a large craft over a lagoon in the jungle. But the witness says he waited to report the event until after Fujimori's reign due to fear of reprisal. And if anybody is familiar with Fujimori, he was the Peruvian president from July 1990 to November 2000, and he's responsible for people going missing. So you didn't want to be on his bad side. But another one where as a multiple witness, multiple day UFO sighting in Chulucanas area of Peru. The Chulucanas sightings gained a lot of media attention and public attention. So this one was essentially their biggest media event. This was the one that got a lot of people's attention, and you'll understand why when you hear how Chamorro explained it. He said, the official cameraman of the local government of Chulucanas was on his way to film an assignment when he saw a lot of people in the street looking at an object. He started to record and witnessed an enormous shape-changing craft maneuvering in the sky. It was at night, but even then you can see in the video that it's triangular, very large, and that it's above the city because the cameraman did a very good job throughout his taping of recording the surface and the object so that you can calculate its size. So we actually have a little bit of video from a television show that was done on it. And this gentleman you'll see, they'll put his name up, I can't think of it right now, but he was the lead investigator.
Lo que pasa que esto se dio en tres fechas diferentes, el 13 de octubre, el 25 de octubre y el 13 de noviembre. El 13 de octubre del año 2001 aparecieron 8 esferas de luz de 150 a 200 metros de largo, flotando en completo silencio durante 2 horas y media. Fue en plena ciudad, la ciudad de Chulucanas, al norte del Perú. Estas esferas de luz se movieron durante 2 horas y media en constante movimiento, formando figuras triangulares, diferentes figuras geométricas, y lo más importante, que tenían un movimiento inteligente, porque interactuaban con la gente. ¿Cómo es esto? Cuando las personas trataban de acercarse a este fenómeno se abalanzaba sobre ellos. Cuando la gente huía despavorida, con mucho miedo, el objeto volvía a su sitio. Entonces este fenómeno hasta el momento no tiene explicación. La segunda vez se volvió a presentar en esta zona llamada el Valle del Morropón esferas de luz que se prendían y apagaban. Y la tercera ocasión es lo que yo llamo la guerra de los mundos en el norte del Perú, porque lo que pasó fue que este objeto que había estado muy cerca de la ciudad entró por primera vez a la ciudad, bajando lentamente en zigzag ante el asombro de la gente. Estos 3 casos luego fueron investigados y fueron asumidos por mí, que en esa época trabajaba como investigador principal de la oficina OVNI de la Fuerza Aérea de Perú, y fue denominado el incidente Chulucanas. Se han agotado todas las hipótesis. No son aviones, no son helicópteros, no son manifestaciones atmosféricas de ningún tipo, no es chatarra espacial, no hay explicación alguna, Entonces eso nos arrincona ante una posibilidad de que esto sea producto de inteligencias superiores no humanas.
Dr. Anthony Choi is his name. He actually came to a MUFON symposium a few years ago in California, organized by Ruben Uriarte and with the help of Leslie Kane, because he was in her book as well. Here's another weird case that they have that Chamorro thought was very credible. A UFO trying to kidnap a young fisherman in 2008. So essentially what was happened is this 18-year-old fisherman was with his little sister, and they were tending nets when the little girl said, "Look, there's a ship above." He said he turned his head and told her to behave or he was going to take her back home. But just then, he said a beam of heat beamed down onto them. He told the little girl to run into town and to get help, and he dived in the water and hid under the boat. The local residents then came, some of them with firearms, and they all saw the ship. They fired at it, and it essentially flew away. There's a local legend about pelacaras, they call them face peelers, and that's what they thought it was, maybe these face peelers in their ship. But there were a lot of witnesses to that one, and that's why that one they felt was very credible. And then there's this Marabamba case, and that happened in 2013, and it's really the reason, if you remember, due to budget constraints, they had to close in 2005. They reopened again in 2013 because of this case. It was featured on Peruvian television show El Sexto Dia, the sixth day, and during their investigation, they also caught video of the UFOs. Unfortunately, you know, that video is really difficult to find. What there is available is real poor resolution, but there were UFOs being seen in this area, and they were mostly balls of light being seen not just in the sky, but along the hills out there. The film crew went out there, and they caught them themselves on their own cameras. That created a big public excitement about UFOs, and that's what caused them to reopen. They said that reopening was in response to the significant increase in claims and reports of anomalous aerial objects, commonly referred to unidentified flying objects in the skies over our Peruvian territory. Argentina, this was a short-lived organization. It was unfortunate because it was kind of exciting. They've got some really great cases. But they opened the Commission for the Investigation of Aerospace Phenomena in 2011. That's when they announced they were going to do it. But they opened, you didn't hear much from them. Then in December of 2015, they released a report. It was an investigation of 10 cases. These 10 cases were thoroughly investigated and in cooperation with their civilian organizations who they met with often. So that was pretty cool. That was like the Air Force meeting with, MUFON to investigate cases. However, all of these cases, they were able to find solutions, and most of them were in 1 month. So it almost looks like they became active for a short period of time to show they were doing something, perhaps to justify a budget, but then they were closed in February of 2015. Most of the cases they investigated were about that same time at the end. So not much happened, and their website was probably the most simple. When they released this report, it's down now. It was probably one of the most simplest websites I've ever seen. It was white with black text, kind of explaining what they do and a link to their report, and that was it. So a very low effort, which is unfortunate because they have some really cool cases. And this is one of my favorite cases in Argentina that, many people were hopeful they were going to cover. This was exciting because this case happened right when we started Open Minds, and we were working with some of the people out there in Argentina when it took place. But as you can see here, this is the track of the object. And it was mostly seen in this town and then in this, over this lake where there's a dam. But it's exciting. So what happened is shortly after 1 a.m. on Thursday, November 26th, in 2009, a lot of people were outdoors eating ice cream, drinking soda, and otherwise trying to weather out a very hot night on the town at J.V. Gonzalez. So essentially, it's really hot out. So, and people can't sleep, so a lot of people were just outside hanging out, drinking, and having ice cream. Or if you're Michael here, you drink and eat ice cream at the same time. So put them together. Suddenly, a huge luminous cigar-shaped object appeared in the sky and remained visible for approximately 55 minutes. The UFO was pulsating with red and white flashes, and no sound was heard. It then moved in a southwesterly direction towards the electric power plant and dam of El Tunal in the neighboring department of Matan. They call counties essentially departments, which is about 20 miles away from the town. At this point, a total power blackout hit the town of Gonzales in an area of about 120 square miles. The outage lasted for about 12 hours, and telephone lines were also dead. A bookseller from Tucumán was fishing with friends on the man-made lake next to the power station when the incident occurred. According to this witness, while they were fishing, they suddenly noticed a white or yellowish light all around them. As they looked up, they noticed a huge object hovering over the turbines and emitting and humming an sound. He estimated that the UFO had a length of 500 to 1,000 feet. He then described how the object threw beams over the turbines, and the beams could also be seen coming from the turbines to the UFO. The whole operation was accompanied by a sound like that of several machines working in tandem. So there were witnesses fishing there when they saw this object go over. A really great case, but unfortunately it did not get investigated because they didn't investigate much. So those are the official government organizations that are out there. Not a whole lot of them, but especially Chile's really exciting because they're so active and they're getting something done. General Bermudez, as he said, was seeking for an international organization, so there's some cooperation. In particular, he felt the UN should be doing that. He wasn't the only one that felt that way. Actually, in the 70s, this gentleman, Sir Eric Gary, felt the same way. He was the Prime Minister of Grenada. He began an effort to create a UFO committee at the United Nations. Journalist Lee Spiegel, who comes to the UFO Congress quite a bit, he's a good friend of mine, he helped Gary in 1978. Essentially what happened in 1977 is Gary said, I think the United Nations needs to create a department to investigate UFOs. They said, okay, he was a member state, they had to do something about it, but they kind of stalled him until 1978 when Lee Spiegel got involved, and I'll talk more about his involvement, but Gary said he wanted to do this because he had seen a UFO himself. He said, I've myself seen an unidentified flying object and been overwhelmed by what I've seen. But my main interest in this matter is not scientific, but essentially political, since I am of the firm belief that this world body should take a legitimate interest in a matter which has aroused general world concern, including that of the leaders of several countries. Of his sighting, Gary said that he saw a covey of brightly lit elliptical objects hovering high over the ministerial mansion, then darting silently at tremendous speed towards the southeast back in Grenada. He said the sightings were so anomalous, their potentiality so out of character with the dignity of my office, that I felt compelled to rouse the world out of its torpor and exhort it to take a closer look. I was worried that these apparitions might seriously impact world security. So he had an incredible sighting and wanted to do something about it. Lee Spiegel was some kid wearing bell-bottom pants and cruising around and partying in New York when he saw that Gary was trying to do this. And actually, it's kind of a neat story because Lee just had known about important people who had talked about UFOs. And he decided, he worked in broadcast, I'm going to go to CBS and I'm going to tell them we need to create a record. Because this is before my time, but maybe some of you, Michael, you might remember. Get a pick on Michael. That, you know, if there weren't tapes and stuff like that, they would create records with interviews with people, scientists and others, about different topics, dinosaurs. I did have actually a little dinosaur record when I was a little kid with one of those little plastic things. So he decided we need to make a UFO record, and I'm going to go around the country and interview some important people like Gordon Cooper, J. Allen Hynek, Gordon Cooper being an astronaut who had a UFO sighting. So he was able to talk CBS into doing that. They gave him a budget. He went and he interviewed Claude Poher, who we had talked about earlier from France, Jacques Vallée, psychologist David Saunders, who actually was part of the Condon Committee, because many of the Condon Committee, the people who actually did the research, were like, we don't know what you're talking about, Dr. Condon, but when we investigated these UFOs, we were convinced there's actually something to the phenomena. So he got all of these people and he interviewed them and he made a record with interviewing all of these guys. And so because he had done that, he thought, I want to help Eric Gary out. I want to get these people to come to the UN and talk to the UN about UFOs. So we actually walked to the UN and said, hey, I want to talk to Eric Gary. They're like, well, you can't do that. But people with Grenada did meet with him, and they got the information to Eric Gary, and he said, this is a good idea, let's do it. And so they organized it, and they actually brought these people to the UN. Here's one of the comments from astronomer J. Allen Hynek about the event. The time has come for official education of the public regarding UFOs. We now recognize that apart from its potential scientific importance, it has sociological and political significance. Here's a gathering of the group. On the left here is Gordon Cooper. There is Jacques Vallée, who many of us got to meet at the last UFO Congress. This is Claude Poher, so that's the French gentleman who we talked about with their version of NASA, who started their UFO research. There's Allen Hynek. There's Eric Gary. This is Kurt Waldheim. He's actually with the UN. There's Lee right here, he said this was his Serpico stage with his beard and his hair. Len Stringfield, which some of you may know of, who is a UFO researcher with MUFON for many years. He's passed away since. And then David Saunders, the Condon Report investigator, psychologist. Spielberg actually offered to help, got a hold of Lee and said, hey, you know, he made Close Encounters, the movie, which he based off of real UFO research, and he's really into the topic. He called and had Hynek, Vallée, and Lee meet with them in California to talk about UFOs, and we've got time. This is a really cool interview with Steven Spielberg from this period of time about UFOs.
At an exclusive interview in Hollywood, its director, Steven Spielberg, told us that while he was up to his neck in water filming Jaws, he was really thinking of his next film, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, a film concerned with UFOs.
Just after Jaws finished, I came back and I wanted to relate to dry land, and I also wanted to think about Close Encounters, so I went out to Pear Blossom, which is the desert near Mojave. There's nothing around for miles, and if you want to watch the cosmos, that's the place to stand and do it. I mean, you feel like a grain of salt, and the stars are so vast. I mean, it's almost like looking down at the sky because the sky surrounds you. It's an amazing planetarium show. And I went out there, and I parked my car, turned the lights out, and sat on the roof, and looked up at the sky, and said to myself, if something comes down here right now and lands on the road, and an opening appears, would I get on and take a ride? And I thought about it, and I looked up at the sky, and I got very, very nervous because I realized that I wouldn't get on and take a ride. As a matter of fact, I was getting so nervous by embracing and romancing that thought that I got back in my car and I drove back to Los Angeles. I was terrified. On Eastern Airlines from LA to New Orleans, and my production designer, who was on the airplane with me, was talking to the stewardesses about the movie we were making, and he mentioned to one of the stewardesses that it was a film about dealing, you know, with UFOs. And the stewardess apparently went into the cabin and mentioned this to the pilot, and all of a sudden this big, steely, gray-haired guy with wings on his chest comes out, the pilot of the airplane. They point me out. He sits down next to me, and he said, will this be a serious movie, or is this just going to be a comedy or a sci-fi? And I said, no, we're taking the subject very serious. And then, knowing that I wasn't about to laugh in his face and ridicule what he was about to tell me, he sat down and he told me two experiences he had while flying with Eastern. One was a nocturnal light that traveled very, very quickly across his glide path. It startled everybody because of its speed. It wasn't a shooting star. It wasn't up there. It was eye level. and moving very, very, very quickly, something that was passing very close across his bow. I wouldn't put it past this government that a cosmic Watergate has been underway for the last, 25 years. And at the same time, I don't think it's, I think as we're growing up, or from the government's point of view, I think we've been adults for hundreds of years, but from the government's point of view, we're still growing up, and eventually they might want to tell us something about what they've discovered over the decades. There is a rumor that was in U.S. News and World Report a number of months ago that Jimmy Carter might make some unsettling disclosures about the UFO phenomena sometime in December. It's perfect timing. I opened my movie in December, so it's perfect timing.
It's a funny comment, his last comment, just because it demonstrates, because even now we hear these rumors. Now there's a big rumor right now that Obama in the next few months is going to say something about UFOs. But unfortunately, that's been going on every year since Lord knows how long, and it never happens. But actually, what's interesting about this story, just like there is some meat behind at least some of the stories, which we may get into a bit with this President Carter, he actually did try to start up a UFO organization, and he went to NASA and he asked them to do it. There's a whole story, and now we have the government records. You could Google on or search on our website and find more about the story. But essentially, the NASA got a message from the Air Force saying, we tried this, it was a nightmare, don't do it. So NASA essentially sent Carter a message saying, we are going to have to decline this offer. So they told him, no, we don't want to do it. But they did approach the UN. Here's a video of that meeting. So they had a day where they showed, UFO videos. They had all of these people speaking to the UN about, you can see some of these people down here. We'll see what they looked like back then. I have a great picture coming up here of Stanton Friedman and a jacket that looks a lot like a couch we used to have from the 70s. But they're showing UFO videos and stuff like that. So this event really took place and was taken seriously. There's Eric Gary and Hynek talking right there. I think that's the only footage I know that exists. Here's one of the pictures where they were listening to one of the witnesses. This was Larry Coyne. He had a really interesting close encounter in 1973. He was a helicopter pilot. This is a picture of what he says he saw. He said he was a skeptic, but they were returning to Cleveland's Hopkins Airport from Columbus at about 11 p.m. on October 1973. His crew chief spotted a red light on the horizon. They're near an Army National Guard base that housed several jets, but he verified it wasn't one of them. They were cruising at 1,500 to 2,500 feet when they first saw it. The light sped towards them at 600 knots. He went to dive, expecting that this object was going to impact them, but it didn't. He noticed that instead of diving, his helicopter rose to 3,500 feet. So he went to dive, and instead his helicopter started going up. He said the object was shaped like an airfoil or a streamlined fat cigar. There was a red light on the front of the nose. There was a center dome light and a green light at the rear reflected on the hull. He said that the green light swiveled like a spotlight and a beam through the canopy of their aircraft, bathing their cabin in the green light. The UFO finally moved off to the west and was gone. So this is one of the best cases from the time. It did get some media attention, but Coyne was, highly regarded as a credible person. Here's a picture. They're Stanton in that suit. But yeah, you can see Valet and some of these other. So, the issue passed. It was a resolution to create a department. However, they watered it down, and they called it what is a decision. A decision doesn't mean it actually enacts anything, but it does mean it goes on to the official record. So what went on to the official record? Instead of creating an actual department, what they did is they had taken the statements regarding flying saucers. They said they would take appropriate steps to coordinate a national level scientific research and investigation. But, I mean, essentially what they said was they would ask for the Peaceful Use of Outer Space Committee to take a look at it, and that member states can send information about UFOs to the UN. They didn't say they would do anything with that information or necessarily disseminate it, but they said that they would take the information, which was about it. So they really watered it down. Why didn't they pass the whole thing? Well, some member states were against the whole thing happening. Interesting enough, now that we have freedom of information, we can get these documents to see what the government correspondence was. The United States, like I said here, their opinion was, they didn't really care whether the event happened or not. They essentially said they didn't want to hurt their relations with Grenada. They didn't want to get involved with trying to counter anything. They just didn't think much would happen of it. They liked the idea of possibly sending the information to letting the Space Committee decide something with it. But that was about it. However, the UK, we now know, was completely against it. They had a real problem with it, and they were trying to organize to defeat it. In this brief prepared by D.A. Lloyd of the Energy, Science, and Space Department of the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, written in 1978, he said that their aim was to oppose the establishment of any such agency. They said that the points they want to make to achieve this was that the British delegation does not think that the establishment of an agency for research into UFOs is appropriate to the functions of the United Nations. It considers that the existence of such an agency under UN auspices would be an unjustifiable drain on UN resources which could be deployed elsewhere. Tactics, they said, hopefully a confrontation with a representative of Grenada can be avoided, but the UK should not hesitate to make its view known as and when appropriate. You should seek whatever support you can, particularly among the 9, meaning the 9 top members of the UN. So there was other information. The British totally opposed it. What did the Grenadans think of their prime minister going to try to get the UN to talk about UFOs? They loved it. These are a group of stamps, but he was a hero to them. I mean, they really loved him. It was a really popular idea then. They didn't have a problem with it at all. They felt that Eric Gary was actually their first prime minister since their independence, and they really appreciated him. However, he wasn't really able to push anything forward because he was essentially ousted. There was civil conflict that broke out in his government, and he was pushed out. He did come back later, but for a period of time he was pushed out of government, and so he didn't pursue anything. The interesting thing is, and the implication and the important part of that, that has not been lost to all of the countries that do have official UFO organizations, including people like General Bermudez, is that that decision is still on the record. That can be activated. A member state could come and say, okay, let's ask all of our member states to send information about UFOs to the UN, and they can volunteer to organize and actually do something with that information at an official level, at the UN level. Bermudez and others are considering going that route and trying that. The point, I guess, being with that UN issue and that still being open is that the story, the moral of the story, is that it's a very positive thing, that there are these organizations out there. These are their different symbols. Safa, Japan, DIFA, and all these organizations that are professionally working on this issue. And if anything, their influence is growing as time goes on, especially people like SEFA that are doing this work. And there is some precedence in the UN. So there is a movement outside of the United States to get governments to take this all more seriously, and it is growing and moving forward, which is a very positive thing. The other interesting aspect is that it does set some precedents for our country and for others for organizing UFO investigation in many different ways. So, for instance, Japan is part of their NASA. In Uruguay, it's part of their Air Force. In Chile, it's part of their FAA. In Peru, it's part of their Space Command. In Argentina, it's Air Force. Meaning that there's all of these different routes to agencies that could house something like that. And that gives you just different opportunities of different organizations to lobby to get something like that done. That's the end. There's just one other thing I wanted to talk about, which kind of actually pertains. This is a story we've written recently, and it has to do with revelations with the UFO WikiLeaks. So, in other words, there was a lot during the election about WikiLeaks. And I know we all want to put the elections behind us. But now that they're over and we know what emails, we have all of the emails that were leaked. They were leaked by a man named John, or they were emails. The emails that were leaked were of John Podesta. They were John Podesta's emails. He was the campaign manager for Hillary Clinton. In the past, he also was Secretary of State for Bill Clinton. He was an advisor for Obama up until he went to go work for Hillary. He's also a big UFO enthusiast. Big UFO enthusiast. In fact, he essentially he's a big tweeter too. And he tweeted about UFOs quite a bit even during the campaign. In one case, he told Lena Dunham, she's an actress, some of you may be aware, and she interviewed Hillary Clinton, and he said, "Great interview, but you should have asked her about UFOs." Well, eventually the media did ask her about UFOs. Jimmy Kimmel is a famous point, and he had coached her, we see in these emails, to use the term UAP, because he's worked with groups like NARCAP, and they've told him, UAP is the more acceptable term among the more serious scientific people. But that's interesting. We already knew he was into UFOs, and he tweets about UFOs. But what's really weird is his emails with a rock star named Tom DeLonge. Tom DeLonge was a frontman for a band called Blink-182. He now broke with Blink-182, and he's got a band called Angels and Airwaves. But he's told the media he broke with Blink-182 because he began working with government insiders on UFOs and getting UFO disclosure. And he wrote a fiction book recently about it. However, he's told in media reports that he has government insiders he's worked with that gave him the information for this fiction book, which is about back engineering alien technology. He's done some interviews with George Knapp, who knows him well. He's actually come to the UFO Congress. You probably didn't notice because he's very quiet and he doesn't make a big deal, but he's been there, especially at the Saturday night dinners. Nobody knew, is he really telling the truth? Is he really working with government insiders? Is he lying about this? If so, who are these government insiders? He said he was approved and told he could use the term that he's working with government insiders and the NASA personnel about aliens and back engineering UFOs. And that his goal is to get UFO disclosure. Well, in the Podesta emails, we found that Podesta had set up a meeting with Tom DeLonge, a general who worked at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base and was in charge of the research labs, named McCasland. Wright-Patterson's important because that's where Project Blue Book happened. All of our UFO research happened at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. Also, allegedly, when the craft crashed in Roswell, that's where everything was taken, was to Wright-Patterson. Also invited to this meeting, it was a Google Hangout, by the way, which is kind of funny, was a executive in charge of Skunk Works, which is the organization who built and runs Area 51, and also a guy who is recently retired who was the assistant to the commander of Air Force Space Command. Through further research, we find that he's been talking with this guy with Air Force Space Command for quite some time. That guy actually did a review for Tom DeLonge's book here. But what's interesting, most interesting about this is that after the meeting, Tom DeLonge sent an email to John Podesta. And he said, McCaslin, the guy who works at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, said he was skeptical, but he's not. I've been working for him for months, and I've briefed him on this. In fact, he gave me 10 government insiders as advisors. Plus, this is a guy who worked at Wright-Patterson, which is where they sent the pieces of Roswell. So this guy is in the know. That's interesting. But then later, Tom DeLonge, or actually prior, Tom DeLonge had posted on his Facebook that he had met a general who had given him advisors, who had told him we had recovered an alien body, and that this was someone who was one of his main advisors, just like he had told John Podesta about McCaslin. So the interesting thing to all of this is that this rock star, we now know, really is meeting with government insiders, and that for some reason he doesn't make it a secret that he's working on UFO disclosure and that that's his main goal. But regardless of that being his main goal, these people are still meeting with him, these Air Force generals. So what does that mean? There's a few different theories. Grant Cameron has been writing a lot about this. You might know him. He's a researcher with presidentialufo.com. He thinks UFO disclosure is imminent and that Tom DeLonge is going to be the guy they've chosen to get UFO disclosure out, and it may be happening as soon as January. Big question mark. Possible. Others have said that's ridiculous, it's disinformation, that they're probably giving Tom DeLonge wrong information so he sends it out and gets people confused. And there's a history of that. And in this story you can see more about that. A guy named Robbie Graham, he has a website called Silver Screen Saucers, is writing about it also on a website called Mysterious Universe. There are instances in which the military has approached people in the media and said, we're going to give you evidence of aliens or crashed UFOs, and we want you to tell the world. They begin a project, the project goes underway, and then some moment in the project they say, oh, sorry, we were just told we can't give you that information. But it's typically after these media people have already said, this is what we're working on. And it could be another one of those instances. Robbie Graham says, look, we've seen this happen before. They're just setting up Tom DeLonge. He's just getting duped. And then, of course, there is possibly a third idea, which is just that taken for face value, that they're just trying to help him get, as one of the memos kind of gets into, get the youth involved in science, and they're trying to use Tom DeLonge to help with getting people involved with science and things like that. So who knows what's going on, but it's really, really strange that now we know who Tom DeLonge has been working with, and they really are government insiders. But we just posted a video on that on Friday, if you prefer videos, on YouTube, and we also have a story that goes into this even in more length on our website at openminds.tv. Question? Am I going to be able to interview Tom DeLonge? We have interviewed him before. My colleagues who used to work at Open Minds, they don't anymore, Jason McClellan and Maureen Ellsbury, have interviewed him about his UFO interests. But right now, he isn't really talking about it. He's a little bit embarrassed that his contacts' names have been leaked, so he's a little hesitant to talk. And probably last question, yes.
Alejandro, your talk was really informative, very
Thank you.
Well presented. You haven't mentioned the Soviet Union.
You're right. I haven't mentioned the Soviet Union, and the reason being is that there are some other countries, but getting information is difficult. However, there is a guy who's the specialist when it comes to the Soviet Union. He's written a book called Russia and UFOs. His name, Paul Stonehill. He's actually going to be speaking at the UFO Congress Paul Stonehill. Oh, yeah, and he's going to be speaking here. So he'll be speaking at the Congress in February, here in April, so you'll be able to get more from him. But yeah, Paul Stonehill's really the guy. He speaks Russian, so he's able to read those documents.
Will he be there with his books?
Yes, he'll be there with his books. So he's got a book on that topic. But that is a great point. I also didn't put China in here. China doesn't have their own official government agency. However, they have helped UFO researchers. So when UFO research started out there, they funded a journal for a large UFO organization that continues to print a journal. And we have a book, and we've written about it on our magazine and in our website. We've posted the stories. Wendell Stevens was approached by a Chinese researcher and told he could reprint one of their books. He said, I don't know Chinese. I don't have a budget to do that. The Chinese government translated the book and then provided it to Wendell to print. Unfortunately, it's out of print and we only have a couple copies. But we've written and tried to reproduce as much of that as we can. Some really interesting stories on our website. Just China and UFOs. UFOs over China, actually, I think it is. Yep. That's it?
That's it.
All right. Thank you, guys.